auspicious occasion. And Her Majesty has asked that you are thanked for your kind letter of law greetings on behalf of members of Greenock Burns Club, the Mother Club, sent on the occasion of your dinner to mark the bicentenary of the birth of Colin Ray Brown, being held this evening on the 13th of November. Her Majesty appreciated the thoughtfulness in this communication and in return has asked that her warm good wishes to all of those who will be present here this evening are sent, and her wishes for a most enjoyable evening. I might
At this stage, we come to the principal speech of the evening, and that speech will be given by Professor Jerry Carruthers. Jerry is, of course, the honorary president of the club.
President Ian, promised, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, who was Colin Ray Brown? Well, we might begin to answer that question by saying that he was a cultural activist. That's a phrase that Ray Brown himself wouldn't have known, but that's what he was. And basically, in his case, what it means is that he has affected aspects of the landscape of Greenock, of Scotland, and indeed of the wider UK. And not only the geographical landscape, that I'll speak a bit about, but also the imagination of these places. We're familiar with the idea of engineers in the Victorian period, but to borrow a phrase from Walt Disney, as well as engineers, we have Imagineers, and Colin Ray Brown, most decidedly, was one of those in the Victorian period. And what those Imagineers did, and we're in a very suitable setting to think about this, is that they had a monumental mindset. They built, literally, monuments, great buildings, and they had a strong sense of monumental community. And in the case of Colin Ray Brown, that extends to the Burns community, the Burns movement, of which he is one of the principal architects in the 19th century. And we might start with Colin Ray Brown's contribution to the Burns movement. Clark McGinn may tell us a bit more about this later, but even Clark, with his great hero Hamilton Paul, the brains behind the development of the Burns Supper, even Clark would probably suggest, and has suggested in print, that Colin Ray Brown might be the most important Burnsian of the 19th century. And it's easy to see why. Born in 1821 here in Greenock, by the 1840s, still in his 20s, he is for the first time, first of two times, president of the Mother Club, Greenock Burns Club, and that is very suggestive of the great energy with which Colin Ray Brown was endowed. What we get also from Colin Ray Brown is going on to help the completion of the Highland Mary project here in Greenock, which is not without its controversy, and related to that, being one of the main brains behind the Highland Mary statue in Dunoon. And if we continue very rapidly to think about this contribution to Burns' monumentality, we have also his establishment, his foundation of the London Burns Club in 1882, with many Burns suppers, indeed 12 years in a row, held at his house. He is also one of the main movers behind the Burns Federation in the 1890s, and part of his journalistic nous, to which I'll return, is very much the brains behind the Burns Chronicle, established in 1892 and still running down to the present day, the longest running Scottish studies journal anywhere in the world. Also in 1859, at the time of the Centenary Celebrations are taken by the scruff of the neck by Colin Ray Brown, because, and I'm going to go into politics in a number of ways tonight, but I'm not particularly being party political. There is a point in 1859 when there is a certain limited Tory interest that wants to corral the Burns festivities for its own party interests, and Colin Ray Brown is the man who says this should be a celebration for everyone. And this is why there are so many Burns suppers, over 1,000 across the UK and the rest of the world, and an accessibility. And from that moment in 1859, in some ways one can argue, the Burns movement is genuinely and quite radically, not necessarily politically radical, but quite radically popular. We'll come back and say more about Colin Ray Brown and Burns. I want for a second to return to his monumental works, and again, all I can do in the time I have is be summative. Well known that he is one of the main movers behind the Wallace Monument in Stirlingshire in 1869. Alan Beck has got a very interesting piece in the forthcoming Burns Chronicle that talks about the debate over the design. We've got the design as we have it today, celebrating Wallace, the great hero of the 14th century of the so-called Scottish Wars of Independence. Some of the original designs were much more to do with Anglo-Scottish tension, and Colin Ray Brown interestingly says, no, can we get rid of the Anglo-Scottish tension? Can we just, in a kind of one-dimensional way, in a sense, celebrate Wallace? It's quite ecumenical in his politics, and I'll say a bit more about that. Again, in terms of monumentality, he plays an important part in the establishment of the Scott Monument in 1871. We'll come back to those three figures as well. In the 18th century, we have the Scottish Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, the explosion of ideas, is the thing that takes us towards the 19th century and beyond, and individuals like John Logie Baird, Alexander Graham Bell, and, seriously, Mr. Scott of the Starship Enterprise. He stands in that line of Scottish engineering nous. Now, although Colin Ray Brown isn't quite in that class in some ways, nonetheless, his imagination, his imagineering is of that standard. What he does in the 19th century, as I've sort of hinted at already, is he begins to provide for Scotland a canon, a list of great cultural and literary and historical achievement, Burns, Scott, Wallace, etc. And this is foundational in the way in which we see Scotland in the modern world. He's also very much a regional figure. I think this is very important post-COVID. He has a huge civic imagination, something that we see in his work with Greenock Burns Club. He thinks that regionality, as much as nationality, is important. And he develops a number of local strategies. And one of those strategies has to do with him being not only a journalist, but someone who founds a number of newspapers in Glasgow and also later in London. And when he's in London, what else does he do? He's the main man behind the Burns statue on the London Embankment. This is a man who leaves his monumental mark, his Scottish monumental mark. There's a joke in there about Freemasons that I'm going to resist in the present company. He leaves his monumental mark everywhere. As a newspaper journalist, he is someone who takes his role very responsibly towards employers. One example, James McFarlane, the peddler poet. Had he been a character in Stirling, he would have been James McFarlane, the Jakey poet, because McFarlane had a bad alcohol problem and he could never turn in copy on time. So Colin Ray Brown comes up with a solution. We'll pay him for occasional pieces and is very kind to James McFarlane, and indeed arranges the first collection of his poems. One of the things that he's very involved in as a journalist, as a newspaper man, is opposing the Stamp Act. And this is quite important. From the period round about Peterloo in 1819, successive reactionary British governments seek to control the newspapers by imposing stamp duties. Colin Ray Brown is most emphatic that newspapers should not be fettered by stamp duty. And that is suggestive, not so much that he's a radical lefty, which he isn't, but that he believes, at the very least, in free expression. And that's an area that's still properly to be explored. I'm going to pick up on that again in a moment. Colin Ray Brown is a man of quite manic energy. For a start, he commits a lot of creative writing. He writes fiction, plays, and poetry. He's not a great poet, it's true. He, at best, writes the third best depiction of the Clyde, that I think we're going to hear a bit later. The best two depictions of the Clyde, funnily enough, both of Greenock connections. At number 2, we have John Wilson in his poem The Clyde. And number 1, the best depiction of the Clyde, I'm slipping this in quite gratuitously, the greatest poet of 20th century Scotland was born in Greenock. And if you're wondering who that is and you're puzzled, that tells us something about why this man should be more recognised. And that man at number 1 is W.S. Graham, a phenomenal poet who writes very well about the Clyde. But nonetheless, Colin Ray Brown, in his poetry, is one of many people who inscribe the notion of the romantic landscape of Scotland, which often comes in for some bad press, but in many ways is foundational to the way in which we see our own country, if we're Scots, and the way in which the international world sees the country. It's true that Colin Ray Brown is a man at a time of a high point of the British Empire, and often is seen as, to some extent, an imperial figure. And there's some truth in that, but there's a bit of a twist to this that I'll come to in a moment. Very often his cultural interests, his Scottish cultural interests, are read as an example of unionist nationalism with some credibility, because what lies behind this idea of unionist nationalism is that when the British superstate is developing in the Victorian period, when the British Empire is developing, the Scots are very keen on being equal partners with the English, and one of the ways in which you do this is emphasise your own cultural achievement. Wallace, Scott, and everything else. And certainly there's some truth in this, and if we think about Robert Burns for a moment, the 19th century in which Colin Ray Brown is involved is a response to a myth of Scottish primitivism, which Robert Burns responds to in To a Haggis, which we've heard tonight. To a Haggis is kind of a joke, but it's also serious, because in that poem, Robert Burns says, basically what you need is good, simple foods. That is the backbone of the people. And then when we get to the 19th century, it's people like Colin Ray Brown and others who look for building big Scottish things. This town hall where we're sitting tonight is partly a product of that imperial desire in Scotland. Down to the 1960s at least, the Scottish National Party had a strong imperialist impulse that comes out of that long-standing idea of being equal partners in the project. So Colin Ray Brown fits into that, but when we look at his poetry, we see some interesting things. And let me give you a couple of examples, again very rapidly. One of his poems is An Emigration Lay, where he talks about the good Scottish folk going overseas, and he says they take their values, their morality, their goodness, their technology, and it's the kind of thing that these days we're kind of taught to decry. But actually, down to the last couple of decades, we probably all of us, quite unquestioningly, bought into a notion of British progress, of the empire as certainly not completely evil. So we shouldn't be too quick to judge Colin Ray Brown, and especially when we look at that text, there's something else that I want to point out that's quite surprising, perhaps, to our complacent modern eyes. He says these people go overseas taking their Scottish values. That's quite good. But why do they need to go there? And he says it is partly because of vile feudal thrall. What he's having a pop at is landlordism, is the reactionary laws about land ownership in Scotland and elsewhere. He's saying these people in Scotland wouldn't have to go overseas if we had proper laws that gave them their share of what we have here. One of the things that influences Colin Ray Brown quite obviously is the literary movement that is led by Charles Dickens. One of the things that Charles Dickens does in his fiction is draw awareness to the appalling social urban conditions in cities and elsewhere in Britain. It's quite clear when you read Colin Ray Brown's poetry that he's imbibing that. And I want to insert a kind of footnote here, or a kind of an interpolation, but nonetheless I think this is worth saying because there's some misunderstanding of this. Insofar as English literature scholars of the 19th century know about Colin Ray Brown, they see him as a slightly naughty man, apropos Charles Dickens. Because the story is that in 1858, someone approaches Charles Dickens and says, I've just been told by Colin Ray Brown that you had kids with your sister-in-law. And Dickens is appalled. He says, that terrible man, I'm going to mount a legal action. And word gets back to Colin Ray Brown, and Colin Ray Brown says, yeah, I was asking what was going on, but I didn't say this. And Dickens never actually takes legal action towards him. In fact, Dickens' friend Thackeray had heard the same rumours, and they were a kind of refraction of what was actually going on in Dickens' life. He was about to leave his wife, he was carrying on with a teenage actress. There's a lot of stuff that would have him cancelled today, quite clearly. He might yet be cancelled, as so many people are. And Colin Ray Brown was simply, as a good journalist, attempting to find out discreetly a bit of truth. But Dickens was very jumpy. And Colin Ray Brown was appalled because, as I say, he was genuinely influenced by, genuinely admired Charles Dickens. Let's throw another few things into the mix about Colin Ray Brown's politics, both cultural and perhaps in some other ways. He is someone who's outspoken on behalf of Polish liberty at a time when that country is getting caught between Russia and Germany. He's a friend of Napoleon II at a time when other people are writing sort of proto-Brexiteer nonsense. He is the man who gives us a kind of version of European Union. He says, Britain and France now, in the late 19th century, should go hand in hand in a pact of peace that will influence other people. Colin Ray Brown is also a writer of bad Jacobite songs. Charlie's Coming is a particularly bad one. But at the same time, he writes poetry that celebrates poets like Macfarlane, who were mentioned, also William Tom, the poet of Inverurie, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to say the P word here, Paisley. He is a man who says in one of his poems, write for the people, you weavers of song, write for the people. And what he's clearly got in mind, good Greenockian though he is the weaver poets of Paisley. He is very much into the idea of poetry and culture and newspapers being for the common people or the ordinary people, or for us all as much as anyone. I've mentioned romantic landscape. He writes a lot about that, very movingly often. He's a very good writer of sonnets. I often say to my students, if you feel that you want to commit creative writing, start with a sonnet. If you can write a good sonnet, you're on your way to being a writer. And he writes a good sonnet on Shakespeare, and another sonnet that we'll come back to. Shakespeare's his great hero, because dare I say it, in Greenock in Scotland, the greatest writer ever to come out of Great Britain is William Shakespeare. It's just undeniable. Interestingly, in terms of his involvement with the Burns movement and some other aspects of Scottish culture, he writes very movingly about Thomas Chalmers, the Free Church preacher. I think there's a very interesting point here that takes us to the heart of Colin Ray Brown. There's a myth long-standing about the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, and that myth is that the progress of the Enlightenment, the thinking of Adam Smith, David Hume and others, eventually dispels religious fanaticism, and Presbyterianism and Calvinism and all that stuff gets kicked to the side in the face of progress. There's another story, in fact, and that story is the Free Church Enlightenment. Thomas Chalmers, great social reformer, one of the men very much in favour of, in 1843, a third of the kirk walking out of away from two-thirds of the kirk, because what they wanted was ministers to be elected by the people. They were not going to be told how to worship. These were people of great conscience. 1843, long after the Enlightenment, we get the Free Kirk, we get Thomas Chalmers, who is successively Professor of Moral Philosophy and then Professor of Divinity at St Andrews, very erudite, intellectual man. And it's interesting that Colin Ray Brown writes so movingly about Thomas Chalmers in a particular poem. Because one of the myths, and this is where Robert Burns doesn't help, one of the myths of Enlightenment and Enlightenment progress is that we've kicked these Free Church fanatics out of the way, and Burns's Holy Willie's Prayer, or a poem like the Ordination, is propaganda, because Burns is a moderate. He doesn't believe in the people choosing their own ministers, as opposed to the popular party, the hardline Calvinists, the tradition in which Thomas Chalmers stands. And Colin Ray Brown, writing in favour of Chalmers at Chalmers' death, Colin Ray Brown also, one of the main movers with people like Hamilton Paul of the New Burns movement, making Burns acceptable, shows us something very interesting. Colin Ray Brown is open to the Free Church guys, but also to the Burns movement. And one of the reasons that the Burns movement and the reception of Robert Burns is difficult in the 19th century, and we've lost a sense of this, is that Burns hadn't much been a poet of the people. Burns was someone who was very suspect down to the 1820s or the 1830s, because most of the folk, most of the Presbyterians in Scotland, inclined towards popular party views. Colin Ray Brown is one of the people opening up space for Robert Burns, but still saying we should be aware of Thomas Chalmers and the traditional Calvinist line. He's quite culturally ecumenical. That's something that we haven't quite got to grips with yet. Another sonnet that is written by Colin Ray Brown, very good sonnet, technically very accomplished, is on Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that comes close in the 19th century worldwide to outselling the Bible. And this is one of a number of poems written by Colin Ray Brown against slavery. So where is your imperial man at this point? He's not there. He's something else. He's more complicated. He's more widely sympathetic. And in that sonnet, Colin Ray Brown writes of Harriet Beecher Stowe, "No giant arm, or no male arm, hath cleft the flinty rock of slavery, from which the waking waters fall and flow. Woman, the first of humankind enslaved, hath trod on slavery, that accursed thing." So we've got proto-feminism and we've got abolitionism. Not bad for a man who's supposed to be part of the imperial mainstream. And these days, in the early 21st century, we tend to see the Victorians as over-earnest, as over-moral, in a way we're quite dismissive of them. And it's part of the horrible presentism in the early 21st century, where we're quite arrogant towards the past. We trample on the past, and that past is something that physically and in abstract imaginative terms is still very much with us, again in this building, physically, but also imaginatively. that bigness of imagination which men like Colin Ray Brown establish. What did the Victorians, what did Colin Ray Brown ever do for us? Well, the short answer is a hell of a lot. And Colin Ray Brown is someone that Greenock and Scotland and the wider world ought to be decidedly proud of. So could I ask you please to stand and to toast the memory of Colin Ray Brown.
McKelvey will read On the Clyde.
And this is On the Clyde by Colin Ray Brown. I cannot well but love thee, noble Firth, near whose familiar strand my place of birth, a sweetly nestled cottage, fair to see, smiled forth, half hid amongst rich greenery of grateful birch, gnarled oak, and palm-like pine, with hedge of thorn, sweet briar, and eglantine. Huge masses of grey rock lay on the shore, and granite boulders which the icebergs bore from northern coasts, how many years ago? On these, o'er these, I have leapt to and fro, and in and out the pools that midst them lay, from dawn till dusk, how many a day. These hills are just the well-known hills of yore. That spacious river shineth as before. There are the rugged cliffs on which I played. Here the bright pebbly beach on which I strayed. I see the lowly cottage by the wood, still nestling in its leafy solitude. The blue smoke still in filmy wreaths ascends, and still around the hearth may mingle friends. But not the early loved, the lost, the true, the dearest joys my childhood ever knew. Beauty's blithe spirit breathes divinely here, clothing in smiles the landscape far and near. Dumbarton's ancient twain-cleft rock I see, a noble monument of ancient chivalry. Below, the shores of Cardross and Ardmore bask in the sunbeams as in days of yore. The smiling village next, with life a-throng, enlivens the fair scene, just as the song that follows a rich, eloquent display leads a fresh charm nor drives the old away. Embosomed in a forestry of green, the Arden Capel turrets here are seen, confronting modestly the bolder towers Argyll hath reared above the lovely bowers of fair Roseneath, that simply sweet retreat where nature's richest charms cunningly meet. Inlets and bays indent Kilcreggan shore, where smugglers oft their hard-earned booty bore. Loch Long is opening up as round I gaze, its rugged peaks hid by the morning haze, sublimely tower above the point of Strone, o'er shores once bare, now fully flanked with stone. Close packed in one long range the villas stand, some rattled up with random, others planned. Kilmun, I know, lies snugly round the way, frequented still, though rather in decay. Sandbank on Hafton shore, the eye can reach its mimic mansions and its long flat beach. Below, the Lazaretto house still stands, though some rude knaves with sacrilegious hands have pulled the quaint old Lazaretto down, to form upon its site a villa town. But no, old Gordon now does ply the oar, to row as in a trice from shore to shore. O matchless panorama, rich in charms, gazing on thee the wanderer's bosom warms, while thoughts of the old time steal o'er his heart and whisper, childhood is life's better part.
The toast to the Greenock Burns Club, the Mother Club, will be given by Dr. Clark McGinn. Clark, of course, is a renowned Burns author and past president of the Burns Club of London. And we're delighted that you could come along this evening, Clark, to toast the club. Thank you.
Mr. President, my Lord Lieutenant, Moderator, Lord Lion, Provost, President and Office Bearers of the Robert Burns World Federation, distinguished guests, and my fellow hangers-on, welcome. It is indeed a pleasure and an honour to stand here before you to toast the Greenock Burns Club, the Mother Club. It is, I need hardly tell you, or for those of you who have read the two banners at the front door, which was the purpose of my speech tonight, I need not tell you that this is the oldest existing Burns Club in the world. It well deserves its name as Mother Club. And tonight especially, we remember it was where Colin Ray Brown cut his Burnsian teeth. I think it is an interesting footnote, ladies and gentlemen, that while the pool of talent in Greenock only allowed Colin Ray Brown to have presidency twice, we in London managed him 17 consecutive years. Which is why I asked Alan Beck, who I first met in Houston, Texas, but that's a long story, and the criminal records have long been pulped. Why I said to Alan, why do you want somebody from London to come up and talk to the Greenock Burns Club about the greatest Greenock Burnsian? And he said, Clark, your speech will be like a B-Day. He said, nobody's really knowing what it's there for, but it sort of adds a touch of class to the tale. So here I am, a man from Ayr, so that's not that far away from Greenock. I've seen the Waverley come in, I've shared the weather. Like you in Ayr, it only rains twice a year, September and then from pretty much October through to June. So coming back to Greenock is a very important thing. For of course, the fathers of the Mother Club were the Greenock Ayrshire Society. People from my town, from my county, and from the other Ayrshire people here tonight. Old Ayr one there too surpasses for honest men and bonny lassies. It is not quite as consistent nowadays. I went to Ayr last time, I got off at the station, all the bits of it that are falling down, nice to see a big sign saying, welcome to Ayr, beware of pickpockets and prostitutes of making it to Ayr. A final link, and one that Jerry talked of, is of course I left Scotland and like Colin Ray Brown went down to London. The difference was he was a great entrepreneur, whereas when I left, my professor solemnly adjured me that I was going to raise the average IQ of both nations by leaving Scotland. There I've been for the last couple of decades doing missionary work, but still I have not managed to get English people to eat square sausage. So it's wonderful here tonight with so many different people coming to remember not just Burns, but somebody who really made Burns his life. It's not surprising that we're having a great party. The Centre for Robert Burns Studies under Jerry's management produced a map showing all the people having Burns suppers across the world. 9.5 million people last year celebrated this man. And so much of it, as Jerry has told us, is down to the vision, the monumentalism and the bigness of Colin Ray Brown. Why so successful, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I suppose the simple question is, did Burns like a party? Yes, he did. So when we celebrate Burns by using his poems and songs in the way that he would have done it himself had he been alive today. And the Greenock Burns Supper is an exemplar of that. that convivial commemoration, not po-faced, not completely over the top, well, sometimes they're completely over the top, but the way that we come together to celebrate Burns is the way that he would have done it himself. And right from the very beginning of this ancient and honourable Burns Club, the same things we'd see in the Burns supper. The haggis, which we saw tonight, addressed with exemplary skill, the toast to Robert Burns, and the celebration of his poems and songs. Those three things started in the very first Greenock Burns Club suppers, and they continue today. But Greenock has added so many things. In 1826, the immortal memory was cheered by the members. Up to then, they had remembered the death of Burns, not his immortality. Thank you, Greenock. I am very conscious that the immortal memory, like any speech, or this speech in particular, should not go on too long. Frank Shaw of the Atlanta Burns Club famously says, the mind can only absorb what the bum can endure. So what I want to commend the Greenock Burns Club is that it wasn't just a Burns supper. It wasn't one night a year. It was taking what Robert Burns asked us to do and to meet with our fellow man and fellow woman and make a difference. From the earliest days, lectures, talks and concerts, the preservation of the memory and the relics of Highland Mary in 42 and in 1917, when there were a couple of other things going on in the world, so it was very good to do that. The inception of schools competitions, bringing young people into Burns. These were things that this club did. These that we'd taken for granted in the Burns world, but which were crafted by the men and latterly women of Greenock. Even with my bifocals, I can see that Greenock is a great port. And as I look out into the Clyde, I think of navigation. And I think the metaphor I'd like to end tonight is that the Greenock Burns Club, the mother club, is the lighthouse for the Burns movement. Like this great port and its great history, it stands firm and sure and developing. It gives a light to so many of us. A light that would easily be missed in other circumstances. And so this, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in your 3rd century of operation, is my wish that you and the people who follow you honour Colin Brown and the men and women of the Greenock Burns Club, but be forever a beacon for Burns. It is my honour and privilege to propose the motion of the Greenock Burns Club.
Thank you very much, Clark. You spoke with insight, you spoke with humour, you spoke about conviviality, and you left us with a message. And what a message for us in the Burns Club today. What a message for us in the Mother Club today, that we be a lighthouse for the Burns movement.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must thank the Burns Club, the Mother Club, for inviting me to speak at this bicentenary marking the life and work of Colin Ray Brown. As Provost, it is more than a pleasure to be here with you tonight, whether you are Inverclyde residents or you're here on pilgrimage. Obviously, that includes the Burns Club President, Ian, and in no particular order, all our speakers and artistes who have added and will add to the gaiety of nations. If you have studied your programme, you'll see I'm billed under the heading Provost's Remarks, and I think it's only fair to give you a preview of those remarks. First, I can assure you that what I have to say will take no longer than 70 minutes or so. The time will fly. Secondly, there will be no swear words, and there certainly won't be any nudity. I am well aware that this may disappoint some, but this is Greenock after all. On a personal note, this is the first big gathering I have attended in 18 months. At that last event, the chair introduced me to 200 pensioners as Provost, what's his name? So much for voter recognition. To my right, I think, I hope, yes, to my right is Jim Wallace, former leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, twice acting First Minister and currently the moderator of the Church of Scotland. Fairly recently, I heard Jim speak to an audience of provosts, and it was fascinating. He covered a number of topics, including anti-Irish racism and the high esteem in which Donald Caskey is still held in France. Jim has the added distinction of being one of the few prominent politicians in the UK who has never assisted the police with their inquiries. I'm so pleased tonight that we have with us Colin Peter McCarthy, Lord Lieutenant for Renfrewshire. COVID has been a particular curse for us here in Inverclyde, and for Peter it has been exceptionally cruel. But even in the face of great personal loss, Peter carried out all his duties admirably and commendably. The Reverend Canon Joseph John Morrow, CPA, is the Lord Lion of the King of Arms. His curriculum vitae is impressive, not just in the law, but also in the fields of mental health and special needs, both of which are Cinderella items on the public agenda. He's not aware of it yet, but we have one or two things in common. He was a Labour councillor. I am a Labour councillor. I also have a cousin whose Christian names are John Joseph, so we're probably related. So, Colin Ray Brown was president of the Burns Club, and Jerry talked at length about him, and it was fascinating. He was president of the Burns Club here in Greenock, back then in 1848. By my reckoning, he was 27 years of age then. That's quite a feat in an age when most were forbidden to speak in public until the age of 48. Brown went on to promote the cause of Burns and his poetry, first in London, then worldwide through the Burns Federation. Brown was Burns' P.J. Barnum figure, who disseminated his works far and wide. This Greenock Club, this Greenock Mother Club, and the Federation are very special, not just here in Inverclyde, but across the globe. Through the likes of Ray Brown, Burns influenced statesmen like Ker Hardy, Garibaldi, and apparently even Joseph Stalin. There are Burns clubs from Belleville to Buenos Aires, and from Troon to Toronto, and this is where it all started, and this is where it continues today. But it's your work beyond Burns nights that makes this club so special. Events like today's are important, and so also is the work that you do with our young people in our schools, spreading the Burns message to new generations. And that's absolutely right, because Burns as a poet had serious and profound things to say about the human condition. Thank you for inviting me here. And on behalf of the people of Greenock and Clyde, may I thank you for your work and for the work you have done not just today, but throughout this year and every year. Thank you.
What though 100 years have fled since our St. John's arose from friendship's ever sacred sea, a haven of repose. From day to day, from year to year, in strength we've seen it grow. Our lodge, that first beheld the light 100 years ago. Let fashion lure the giddy moths who love its gaudy glare, to loved St. John's our hearts shall turn, and seek true pleasure there. We know no strife, we fear no foe, when gathered round its board, but taste thereat the sweetest joys that life's few years afford. From day to day, from year to year, in strength, we've seen it grow. Our lodge, that first beheld the light 100 years ago. Let love and friendship still combine, as in the days of yore, and over our St. John's still shed glad sunshine evermore. Good fellowship shall welcome mirth and true fraternal glee, while past and present hail the light, so dear to masonry. From day to day, from year to year, in strength we've seen it grow. Our lodge, that first beheld the light 100 years ago.
It's now my pleasure to toast the Burns Club of London. There are many clubs and societies in London associated with Scotland. The Scottish clubs include the London Scottish Golf Club, which I found out about just the other day, and intriguingly they play in Wimbledon Common, and you must have a shirt or a pullover or a sweater, not a hoodie, which is red in colour. Even your waterproofs have to be red to play on that golf course. Fascinating. There's a Caledonian club. There's a London Scottish Football Club, which confusingly for me plays rugby, and whose chair, Malcolm, now Lord Offord, also a Greenockian, is with us this evening. And wearing his tie. He'll maybe wear it when he goes to see the Morton if David invites him. There are the churches of Scotland, St Columba and the Crown Court Church. There are charities like Scots Care and the Royal Caledonian Education Trust. There's the Scottish Piping Society of London, of particular interest to me, and just last weekend it held its Baratach Gorham competition, the Blue Banner, where the top pipers from around the world come to play in the Caledonian Club every year. And there's even an organisation called the Pinstripe Highlanders that was founded in 1971 by Scottish pipers who were working in the City of London. and that the Pinstripe Highlanders continue to this day. But of course our interest this evening is the Burns Club of London, and we have a number of members of the Burns Club of London with us this evening, not the least of which is its president and our good friend now, Jim Henderson, sitting just along the top table there. Of course, but for Colin Ray Brown, there might be no Burns Club of London. Imagine that, for as we've heard, he founded it in 1868 and held the dinners in his house for a dozen years or so, with himself, well, who else, as the chairman and the chief orator. I mean, you wanted the big noise at Burns Supper. Run your own, not a bad idea. But I'm sure he would have been inspired in his work in London from his experiences in this club in the 1840s. We were delighted in the Mother Club when President Jim Henderson agreed to join us in the subcommittee which was organising this Colin Ray Brown celebration weekend here. And Jim has made enthusiastic contributions over the months, and we thank him for that. In some ways this weekend, today and tomorrow, we have the culmination. But in others it's not, because a number of us from here will journey to London on the 17th of December to meet our friends in the Burns Club of London, to have a number of events over the weekend, and ultimately to lay wreaths at Colin Ray Brown's grave in Highgate West Cemetery on the 19th of December, which is the exact bicentenary of his birth. So the Mother Club and the Burns Club of London are loosely connected by Colin Ray Brown, and these ties have been, I would say, more than a bit strengthened by our joint activities this year. And of course, the programme of events in London will further lay some cement. My question this evening is, might we build on this? Would we want to? Jim Henderson, all the way from London, has played a pivotal role on our subcommittee, without leaving that room he has with the nice books in behind him. Might we continue and grow the friendship between the clubs through the technology that we have nowadays? And now comes the sort of thing that makes me really popular in the committee, in the club, because without consulting any of them, I'm going to suggest something right now. What about an annual Colin Ray Brown Memorial Lecture, hosted jointly by the clubs online, with each year the clubs swooping round, taking responsibility for getting the speaker and doing the organisation? Is that worth a thought? Yeah. Oh, can't wait till the committee meeting in a fortnight's time. Anyway, whatever will be as far as that little millstone that I just threw in there might bring. But now I have the extremely pleasant duty of asking that glasses be charged and that you join me in the toast to the Burns Club of London. Burns Club of London. The aforementioned legend of the Burns Club of London, Jim Henderson.
Lord Lieutenant, Moderator, Lord Lion, Provost, President of the World Federation, ladies and gentlemen, friends all, it is my privilege to respond to Ian's generous toast. And I don't think I've ever before been surrounded by such brilliance as Boris said when he looked around the Hall of Mirrors. And that's just my flippant way of eloquence and erudition of the speeches tonight. Up till about 20 seconds or so ago. If anyone came here tonight slightly in doubt of whether Colin Ray Brown deserved a celebration as good as this, they must not be in any doubt when they're leaving. And you know, it was really far-sighted of his parents when they named him to very nearly give him the same initials as the Centre for Robert Burns Studies. Well, 3 years ago, I was then also president of the Burns Club of London for its Bicentenary Celebrations. I had to learn that word and how to spell it, especially for that occasion, the 150th anniversary. I have a sneaking suspicion that my colleagues in the club thought from my appearance that I was around in the days of the hero tonight. But I'm a slightly later vintage. I wish I had been, because as we've heard, his passion, he was not only president year after year, but he was the main speaker at the Burns Supper, birthday festival dinner we tend to call it. It sounds a wee bit snooty, doesn't it? But wouldn't it have been wonderful, with his passion, to sit there and hear him toasting the immortal memory of one of his great heroes? Well, I'm really of much later vintage than that, you'll be surprised to hear. But last year on my birthday, one of my friends sent me a card which pointed out I was past the age of computer dating. But I was now eligible for carbon dating. And it's of course thanks, as we heard, to Colin Ray Brown, who we're celebrating tonight, that there was, I'm sure there would have been a Burns Club founded later, but it was founded as early as 1868. There's some doubt about the actual foundation, because he started off by just putting on really good Burns suppers for his friends. And that grew and grew. But we tend to call the date of the Grand Halloween. We've got a real thing about Halloween, haven't we? The Grand Halloween dinner in 1868, which is often regarded as our foundation. He got us in early, and he got us off to a very good start. And of course, it is up to those of us who follow him in steering the club to make sure that we continue his work, which could be described, although I don't know if the moderator would, as missionary work in the great metropolis, in fostering a love and appreciation not only of the life and works of Burns, but many other aspects of Scottish culture, which are well worth importing to the south. Ian mentioned that I've been part of the subcommittee, and it's been wonderful to have that interaction with Ian and his team on that subcommittee. But I need to make it clear, the quality of the event tonight is not any way down to me. It's the home team that did it, and I think they did a cracking good job. Well, the 153 years now history of the Burns Club of London is somewhat dwarfed by the 220-year history of the Mother Club. And I'm very appreciative, Ian, of your kind and generous toast to my club. It really has been a great pleasure getting to know you and working with you and your colleagues. I find working with people is also often one of the best ways of cementing friendship. But tonight, I was not only able to converse with them, I was actually able to be in the same room with them and shake hands with them, which was wonderful. But don't tell Nicola, I'm not sure if that was really a bit didn't have something to think about, Ian. We have something of a president, William Will, who was a great advocate for the Burns vernacular, is celebrated still in our club with a William Will evening. But I think there's a lot of mileage in the suggestion that you have made tonight, because we've all missed being with our friends when we couldn't meet up in person, but Zoom and these kind of conferencing things did help me when I couldn't meet my grandchildren for months, and it helped us through. We had Burns suppers, we had the piper piping the haggis in, carried by his daughter in Aylesbury, and suddenly there was I addressing what looked like the same haggis in Harrow. So we overcame some of the problems, but we also gained something, because we were able to meet and have good meetings in spite of the distance between us. And we'll think of your suggestion, which I heard tonight for the first time, and I think it's well worth working on that together. And thank you for that idea. And we have a lot in common. Well, we have Colin Ray Brown in common for a start, but then the whole federation has Colin Ray Brown as an important figure in the Chronicle. So let's get together. Getting the clubs together was one of his aims, and a very noble aim it is too. Saying that, I'd like to thank the Robert Burns World Federation for all the work it does, and wish Henry a wonderful presidential year, with the rest of it to come. Well, thank you again, Ian, for not only the toast of the club, to my club, but for a really good idea that you've raised, and we'll talk more about that later. Thank you all.
As originator, Lord Lion, Provost, President of the Robert Burns World Federation, Lords, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege for me to toast the Burns Federation this evening. I have now been a member of the organisation for over 20 years. I wish to give 3 cheers for this organisation. Now 136 years old, it has 191 member clubs, along with 152 junior clubs. The clubs are in 18 different countries, and there are 317 individual members, which includes corporate and family members. This is quite a contrast to the 17 members representing 3 clubs who met in the George Hotel, Kilmarnock, on the 17th of July, 1885. This evening, we have a great many clubs represented, including one of the more recent clubs, namely the Calgary Burns Club, federated in the 70s. You have the honour of being furthest travelled. The oldest federated clubs represented here this evening is, as it was in the beginning, London and Kilmarnock. Why cheer the federation? What has it done? I have highlighted 3 main areas for my 3 cheers. The federation aims to promote. It does. First and most recent in 2021, promoting the name and works of Burns was the granting of the posthumous official coat of arms. This was carried forward by the Federation, and particularly by 4 men. Past President Mark Sherland, President Henry Kearney, and Senior Vice President Alan Beck. All 3 guided and supported by none other than the Lord Lion, King of Arms, Joseph Morrow. All 4 men are present this evening. Well done, gentlemen. Well done, the Federation. You have promoted Burns in a unique and very special way. The first of our cheers. The Federation aims to celebrate. It does. The Federation followed the work of Colin Brown after his outstanding organisation of the 1859 celebrations. The Federation has done just that in 1896, 1909 and 1959, and then more recently in 1996, the commemoration of the death of Burns with a week-long programme of events in Dumfries. This was very special, and some people here this evening were present in 1996. The organisation of the annual conference is another way the Federation celebrates Burns in an annual get-together. 2021 at Glenhill Hotel in Renfrew was very special. Our second cheer for the Federation. You know how to celebrate, and you do. The final and perhaps most important duty of the Federation is the Federation aims to educate. It does. This is an extremely strong area of the Federation, as its work with schools indicates. It has a long tradition of encouraging schools and supporting them. This was especially important at a time when education authorities failed to recognise the Scots language and Scots literature. The evacuee pack given to children travelling to safety abroad was particularly thoughtful and poignant example from the history of the Federation and its support for young people. I have kept an exceptional example to the very last, and this idea, surprise, surprise, was proposed by Colin Brown, seconded by Peter Stirling. and that was the establishment of the Burns Chronicle. What a resource this is, and how significant it has been in developing the scholarship of Burns. And then, how quickly the Federation realised the necessity and desirability of the digitalisation of this incredible resource. Well done, the Federation. Education has been at the heart of the Federation. This deserves our third cheer. Whoa, that's our 3 cheers. What a wonderful organisation the Federation has been and continues to be. It has been an honour for me to propose the toast to the Robert Burns World Federation, and I ask you to stand, if you're able, and raise your glasses. I give you the toast, Robert Burns World Federation.
Now to reply to the toast, Henry Kearney, President of the Robert Burns World Federation. Chief Burnsian, hailing from Ayrshire but now residing in Calgary, Alberta, and here he is in Greenock tonight. Fantastic.
Lord Lieutenant, Moderator Lord Lyon, Provost, Brennan, Mr. President, my Lords, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I thank the Senior Vice President Jean for your excellent toast on this very auspicious event, honouring Colin Brown, the founder of this wonderful federation. Earlier on, when I was putting my money into the raffle, and I'm looking up at the big bottle of whiskey, and I'm thinking, Burns was an excise man, and I've got to travel back to Calgary. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get that in there? So I asked Jane to give me some advice. She said, just stick it under your kilt. Thanks, Jane. I bring you fraternal greetings from the former colony of Canada, and in particular from my fellow members of the Calgary Burns Club, the Medicine Hat Burns Club. What a wonderful name that is, Medicine Hat. The Robert Burns Association of North America, and of course from my homeland, Highland Burns Club and the Robert Burns World Federation. I'm so proud to be a member of them all. I'm also very honoured to be the president of this federation, whose foundation 136 years ago occurred chiefly through Brown's drive and foresight, and to wear a splendid chain of offices indeed a special honour as myself, I can assure you. As the club which sparked Brown's enthusiasm for the poet, Greenock Burns Club, the mother club, is extremely dear to the entire Burns movement. And to see in excess of 200 admirers of the bard attend this great event in Greenock Town Hall fills my heart with joy, because it shows that despite all the other troubles in our lives right now, we're still friends just looking forward to a riff, kid, Nick. Before I toast the Greenock Burns Club in reply, I have a few presentations from the RBWF to carry out, and one simple, very simple announcement to carry out later, which I will explain to you. Which I'll do as expediently as I possibly can, because I know we're running short of time. First, to the Greenock Burns Club, for your very generous donation to our coat of arms appeal, I'd like to present a framed copy of the coat of arms, the Robert Burns, to President Greenway. Service to Greenock Burns Club, past President Sandy Rennie. Sandy, we're extremely grateful for your dedication to the Robert Burns movement through your years of hard work in your club. Could you please which can be bestowed by the RBWF. This is the inaugural presentation of this award, and in honour of his bicentenary, we have named it the Robert Burns World Federation Colin Ray Brown Honorary Fellowship. The fellowship will be presented to an eminent and distinguished Burnsian from the University of Glasgow Centre for Robert Burns Studies, a body which he himself founded. There's no need for further introduction, except to say that the RBWF Colin Ray Brown Honorary Fellowship is awarded to my dear friend, Professor Jerry Carruthers.
Thank you very much. Speechless at last. God bless you all.
I realise that Dr. Clark McGinn has already given an excellent toast to the Greenock Burns Club, but my mother always told me that you could never thank your host enough. So I would now ask you to be upstanding and to raise your glass in a toast to our host, the Greenock Burns Club, the Mother Club. Greenock Burns Club. Thank you.
And finally, a personal thanks from me to all of you who came and supported the evening. And a personal thanks to everyone in the club who, in one way or another, has made this evening possible. When I look at everything that's happened for this evening, and indeed for tomorrow, when we shall unveil the restored Ray Brown family stone in the Old West Kirk, a tremendous amount of work has gone in, and in all honesty, very little of it from me. So my thoughts, my thanks go out to all of you who have contributed to make this weekend a great success. Thank you. Auld Lang Syne.